I think I think that's working. So welcome, whoever might be watching. I'm here for a Meet the Students session with David Tatum. I'm Rhiannon Grant. I'm a Woodbrooke Associate Supervisor, and I was one of David's supervisors. And I think David was the first PhD student that I worked with right from the beginning of the process through to completing his PhD thesis. So, David, would you like to just start by introducing yourself? Who are you? What were you doing before the PhD? And what was your PhD about?
Yeah, so my name's David Tatum. I'm a pastor currently in California in the United States. Um, Married, have three kiddos, 12, 16, and 18. After I finished my master's in divinity, I went into full-time ministry around 2007 or so, and did full-time ministry for about a decade before I decided to come back and do my PhD studies. Um, and so one of the things that appealed to me about doing the long distance PhD was that I could do it without having to pick up my family and move and uproot them from life and all that kind of stuff. And so it was nice to find a program that I could do that. Um, my thesis is the title is An Anabaptist Critique of Christendom Christology through the narrative motifs of kenosis and death in the Gospel of Mark. So from an Anabaptist perspective, I continue the critique of Christendom Christology, and I use the Gospel of Mark as kind of the kicking off point for that. So where do you want me to go from there?
Yeah, and
There's
that's
much
there are
much
lots of
more could
things.
be.
Um, so I guess one thing to say is you were a distance learning student, and
Right.
we did everything by video conferencing before the
Right.
whole world caught on to this trend. And so I remember, particularly towards the end of your PhD, we used to confuse some colleagues who'd all moved over to Zoom because we were still meeting on Skype, and that's
Oh
because
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
where we'd started.
yeah.
So
And
yeah.
we did navigate it, COVID successfully together as well. That was always fun. It stopped one of my trips out there,
Yeah.
and then I was able to make another one out there and had to navigate international travel while COVID testing and all that stuff was going on. So that was fun.
Yeah, so that was an additional kind of stress on the whole world, although I think maybe it made less difference to a program that was already long distance. Although, as you say, you did miss out on one of the trips over to the UK that you were expecting to have. What was it like in general to be a distance learning student? Did you kind of feel connected to the University of Birmingham, or and were you also building a community more locally?
Yeah, so it was definitely challenging to do a long distance program. I knew that it was going to be unique in that uh, I wasn't going to be able to have discussions with colleagues and other people on a regular basis. One of the things that really helped me in that process was I ended up starting a Facebook group of people that wanted to discuss this topic of biblical anthropology, physicalism, dualism, all of that kind of stuff. And it was kind of a spin-off from another group. And so that group, as I did my PhD, ended up becoming kind of my own sounding board place to have discussions. I ended up having other professors and authors join, which was really neat, one of which was Richard Middleton. And so that allowed, I kind of created my own space in a way to kind of shore up the absence of doing the online model.
Mm.
Um, so that was very helpful for me. It was also nice just to have the freedom to not have to attend class, to be able to uh, work part-time jobs and kind of uh, one of the things that I learned with the online process is it's very creative. And so there were times where it was really, I was kind of in a flow of doing work. And then there were times where it felt really tough to do anything. And so I found that when when it was going well to ride that wave, and then when it wasn't going well, just to set stuff aside and go work out or go do something else and let it just sit so I could process again.
Yeah, I think lots of people who've written any kind of major project will recognize those ups and downs, and
Mhm.
it's good to be able to have the flexibility to respond to that as it happens and to where the energy is.
Right.
I guess I would hope that it's also helpful to have the structure of the PhD program where you and I were meeting together regularly, and that gives you some continuity and some kind of push to have produced something, or at least let me know what's going on.
Right. There was always that monthly meeting kind of deadline of like knowing that that was coming. So doing writing and research and presenting that to the advisors and getting that kind of feedback. So that helped kind of keep the ball rolling and didn't allow me to slack or not do anything for an entire month. And those meeting times were, I think, vital to the process of really what I learned was to really prepare as much as I could for those meetings and to give you guys as much information as I could so that the feedback uh, was useful moving forward to the next month.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful observation that the more you can give your supervision team, your advisors, the more helpful they can be in giving feedback that's targeted to where you actually are.
Right.
Um, and I guess some of the people who might be watching this are maybe thinking about whether a PhD is the way forward for them. So could you say a bit more about what that supervision process is like? And you had experience of quite a few different supervisors because your
Mhm.
supervision team changed over the time of your PhD. What was that like? How does it feel to have different supervisors, different people have different styles, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think like the initial getting into the university process was I feel like a little bit unique and also helpful in the fact that I found someone on in the university that was working in the realm of study that I wanted to work in, and so I wrote in and appealed. It was Candida, and so kind of presented the material and what I wanted to do the thesis on, and then had multiple advisors, like you said, jump in on the role. And that was helpful, I think, because everybody had their own kind of piece that they contributed to the feedback. And each person had their own different background and so like Candida being strong in the Gospel of Mark was super helpful. I think one of the things that I appreciated about your feedback and emphasis was just the literary aspect of it. And that was important for me because I had been out of academics for years at that point. So getting back into academia and learning the ins and outs of footnotes and how to write and getting back into that stuff was useful. Ben Wood was also great. I think he was my like always positive person. I think everybody like doing a PhD needs that one person. Like if you just have like one person that you feel like is in your corner all the time, um, even like to the extreme, because he just always made me feel like I could do it no matter what.
Mhm.
And so that was really helpful to have him as a cheerleader in that way, because just in the process, you're subjecting yourself to like critical analysis, and there's times where things can feel overwhelming with how big the project is, and you're getting constructive feedback. So having at least one person like that, I had Ben was that for me as a PhD advisor, and then I also had just um, a buddy that I met with that was kind of the same way that we would meet and have coffee and lunch with, and he was just like, "You got this, you can do this." Like, so those people are vital, I think, in the
Mhm.
process.
Yes, you need that kind of support. And it's interesting you're describing kind of cheerleading and support and encouragement and different kinds of feedback that supervisors might give, some of which is more about content, some of which is more about process. So I remember we would talk sometimes about research process. How do you choose what to read? How do you narrow it down? How do you
Mhm.
take that and turn it into a piece of writing, but then also, as you say, the technicalities of the writing. And I remember some of your early writing was it was really good writing, but it was maybe more journalistic. It would have suited a different audience.
Mhm.
And a PhD thesis has a very specific audience, which is PhD thesis examiners.
Right.
And
Too
they,
many people.
yeah, they have very specific requirements.
Yeah.
So there is something about learning to write in that style for that audience. And also, that isn't necessarily just one style. I think different projects need slightly different approaches, and you're kind of developing the right style in which to explain this material, along with developing the argument of the thesis and working on the material itself.
Yeah, and I think probably the feedback that I got early on from several of my advisors, you included, which took me a long time coming around to listen to, was that I needed to just read a lot of journal articles. And my preference was to pick up a book and read a book. And what I found long term was like the more I got into it, the more I was reading journal articles, the more that helped in the process. I was probably pretty stubborn in not doing that enough the first year or so, but I came around and realized that that's part of the process. It helps you write better. It helps you read a short piece of work and develop a thesis statement and all those different aspects. And the spectrum of journal articles really varies, right? Like they're all written differently, so you can see different kind of styles and even pick one that you want to emulate and go, oh, I want to write like this person because it's really um, like I receive it well, so hopefully someone else will receive it well.
Yeah, I think it's useful to, outside the academic world, people are maybe not so aware of academic journals as
Hmm.
even a thing that exists and as a
Right.
publishing space or a source of information. And I think there is something really useful about the way that an academic journal is it's peer reviewed. You can get recent ones, so you get the cutting edge of what people are thinking at the moment. You get, as you say, those short things, so it's not as long, it doesn't take as long as
Yeah.
sitting down and engaging with a whole book. You can get sometimes to the core of a really specific question, but also it gives you this range of writing styles that you can engage with, and I think it's useful to look at a lot of those and to say this is what I want to look like. This maybe is something I don't want to sound
Right.
like in my
Yeah.
academic writing. And, I do encourage people, as you say, to look at journal articles and other people's PhD theses and some of those more specialist sources as well. I think that's really useful. Books obviously are also really important, and
Yeah.
lots of people who they might write two or three journal articles and then they go away and turn that into a book that extends the thinking, and where that is right on topic, it's really useful to engage with that as well. I'm not knocking books at all,
Yeah, me
as you
neither.
can see, but
Yeah, yeah.
mm, yeah, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Uh, mm, yeah, so I was going to go on from that to say I think it's normal over the course of a PhD for someone's idea about what their topic is to develop, to
Hmm.
change, maybe even the focus to change. So I wonder if you could say a bit about what that process was like for you, from what you thought you were going to do when you came in to the finished thesis after all the processes it went through. How did your thinking develop, and what kinds of decisions did you have to make to turn it into one argument that worked as a PhD thesis?
Yeah, well, I think I came in uh, thinking that I wanted to really look at what the Bible had to say about the aspect of like physicalism and dualism, um, and approaching that from an Anabaptist perspective. Then uh, Anabaptists tend to have a canon within a canon, and those are the Gospels. And so I didn't know exactly that I was going to land in Mark coming into it, but eventually, through looking at like Mark and priority and that kind of stuff, I kind of landed on the idea of like Mark being the core within the Gospels and focused in on Mark. Um,
I
I
remember
also,
a certain number of kind of tussles over how much you were going to narrow it, and all of
right.
these other fascinating things in other parts of the Bible that you might have wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and in fact, I think my first year I spent writing my literature review, and that was primarily focused just on Old Testament material and Second Temple material, and that's ended up being about probably 30 to 40% of my initial thesis draft, and that ended up getting tossed, all of it, which was very, very difficult to have spent that amount of time and that amount of research, but it was all not for loss because it was a foundational piece of knowledge that I then used to write the second draft of my thesis. Um, but I ended up having to like continue just to narrow down and focus. I still use some of that information and that material, but I jettisoned pretty much all of my Old Testament material to focus on Mark. And then also my second draft, I had to rework my methodology completely as a result of my first Viva. And
Mm.
so that was a big challenge to kind of move from, at the time, my first methodology was a Christocentric hermeneutic, and while that has been defined, it seemed to be something that was kind of tough to work with, and so I ended up switching over to a narrative theology
Mm.
of Mark, and that was helpful and gave me some different avenues to pursue within the thesis. So it just kind of like I had to roll with the punches throughout the process and like continue to focus in on narrowing it down, which was a painful process, but looking at the first draft versus the second draft and what I ended up coming up with, I'm much more happy with the final product uh, than I would have been otherwise. So,
Mm. Yeah, I think the thesis went on getting stronger through the process, but it was quite a difficult one in some ways. I think
mhm.
something that I was very impressed by about you as a student was that ability to roll with the punches and to say, this is going to make it better in the long run, even when it was painful. And I
Yeah.
wonder if was there anything that you were doing or that maybe was happening around you that supported you in that, that enabled you to keep that positive focus?
No, I mean, nothing specific. I just had to continue to remind myself that this was part of the process, that the the refinement was something that was just going to build to a better final product.
Mm.
Um, and I think in this process, like you just have to be open to listening and open into the critique and know. I think at times it can feel like your advisor's critique is almost like against you,
Mm.
but just reminding yourself like this person is for me, they want to see me succeed, they're giving me this kind of advice and feedback to make it better. Almost like a, like a pencil sharpener or something. Like this, it's painful, but like you have to trust the process.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been compared to a pencil sharpener before, but in the context, I'll take
yeah,
it as a compliment. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think there is that. It can be difficult, and I think supervisors do know that, right? We're also in the position of probably writing journal articles and that sort of thing, that as
Mhm.
well as having been through our own PhDs, working academics are still writing, still submitting things for peer review, getting that kind of feedback, and know that it can be emotionally challenging, but also that everyone in the process is trying to produce the best scholarship possible. And I think, people try, they have different styles, as we talked about a bit earlier, but try and provide that kind of support in the process. And there is something about saying, we know you can do this. We're trying to improve the project rather
Right.
than trying to hurt you or trying to knock it down. Or
Yeah, and I
that.
think in that process, you kind of develop a thick skin in a sense, and you start to learn uh, as the pencil gets sharpener in a sense, like um, when to take your own stand and say like no, like push back against your advisor and go like, okay, like I understand your feedback, but this is what I really think, and this is the direction I need to go,
Mhm.
and and when to like accept the advice and just go like they know better than I do at this point. I think, I had a really critical junction um, after my first Viva when I had to pretty much, I had a fork in the road with my methodology and I
Yeah.
had to choose to either go one way or the other. And we had long discussions back and forth. But ultimately, it came down to me, and like I had to trust my gut and go with like, okay, this is what I want it to be in the long term. So in order to get there, I have to take this road, and that's on me. Um, so, you also have to develop the ability to make it your own and be the expert in that specific topic and field that you're writing on.
Yeah, and that is, I think that's something I often see with research students, that during the course of the project, they start to gain that kind of confidence, and that
Mhm.
definitely happened. And as you say, actually, it's interesting that a lot of that happened for you after your first Viva, and obviously sometimes we would hope people go to a Viva only once, and what
Right.
happened with you was that after the Viva, you had to go away and do a really substantial piece of work and then have a second Viva.
Yeah.
But I think it was after that that you got some more of this confidence. And actually, that maybe is a sign that you were still developing as a scholar,
Hmm.
and that extra time you had to spend on the thesis was really valuable, both in terms of, as you said earlier, you shifted your methodology, the thesis got technically stronger, but also it was a process where you started to have more confidence in it, and by the time you went to a second Viva, you were perhaps able to have more ownership over it and say, this is definitely what I think,
Yeah.
and talk about it more confidently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think we've talked about some of those challenges that you experienced. I will just say, for anyone watching the live stream, I am looking for comments on YouTube. So if you've got any questions for David, any questions about the PhD process, do put those in the comments, and I can pick them up and ask them. Um, I guess I'm also thinking about how did you choose that topic? So you already told us you what you knew you wanted to look at. What does the
Mhm.
Bible have to say about physicalism, about these big questions about life and death, and what's the nature of death? What's the nature of the human, the biblical anthropology stuff?
Mhm.
How did you arrive at those questions? What was it that got you interested in those things? And how did you know that the right way to answer them was to do a PhD?
Right. So doing pastoral ministry, I had always had an interest in going back and doing my PhD. Both of my younger brothers have PhDs in different areas of study. My dad is one of four boys, and all three of his brothers have PhDs. So there was kind of like this, like, oh, like I'm the only one left that doesn't have a PhD. I mean, it was always something I wanted to do anyways. But I came into my topic kind of from a different one that was a launching pad. For re whatever reason, I went through a season of kind of intense study on the topic of hell as a pastor and started looking into like what are the different teachings and kind of coming to learn the ideas of eternal conscious torment and universalism, but then about annihilationism. And it seemed to me that the question that really undergirded that whole discussion, what it was an anthropological question, is what is a human being? Because if a human being is a soul that lasts forever, then you have to either choose eternal conscious torment or universalism. Annihilationism isn't really a choice. But if a person is not, then annihilationism becomes an option within that discussion. And so that kind of launched me into the end question of death and afterlife kind of launched me back all the way into like the Genesis creation question of like, well, what are we in the first place? Because that affects all sorts of different questions we ask along the way, along with death and the afterlife and those sorts of things. Um, so that's kind of how I got into the anthropological question. And at the time, I didn't really like theologically have any skin in the game. I think being raised in uh, within Christianity and the church and just our culture in general, I probably would have found myself in some form of dualistic thought,
Mm.
probably not a trichotomist. Um, but I think the thing that helped me the most as I approached the topic was I didn't is was the fact that I didn't have any skin in the game. I wasn't biased towards one view or the other. I was just genuinely searching for an answer to the question and wanted to look at what the Bible said. And so um, I dove into that pre-PhD and started really looking at what the Old Testament said, and then that took me into the New Testament. And um, I one of the things that interested me initially was the fact that the Old Testament scholars tended to pretty much agree on the topic that the ancient Israelites were physicalists. The question didn't really come until the New Testament, and so it made me really question the topic and be interested in it. And so that's what jumped me into the whole PhD process. And I was like, oh, I've actually found something that is interesting to me that I want to study. Maybe I can turn this into a PhD thesis somehow.
Mm.
Um, and when I initially did my first piece of writing that I had submitted to Dr. Moss. That was focused on eschatology and all that kind of stuff. Um, and so, in the beginning of the process of the PhD thesis, I ended up shifting it back to kind of the initial question of anthropology and setting the eschatology on the side.
Yeah, so there were quite a lot of shifts, even right at that early stage in where the
Mhm.
focus was.
Yeah.
Um, so I wonder if you could like send a message back in time, if you could write a letter of advice
Yeah.
to yourself right at that beginning stage where maybe you were writing the research proposal or just starting the thesis, what would you advise yourself to do? Is there something that you wish you'd known then that you know now?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Because hindsight's always 2020, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think maybe it would just be enjoy the process.
Mm,
Um, because there's so much like fun and creativity along the way, but it's also difficult and you can kind of um, have a myopic approach when you're stressed out and like I had several times within my process where I was like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. And even early on, some of the best advice I got, like when I first my I think my first conversation with Dr. Moss, she had said like, are you sure you're in this for the long haul? This is like years, you know. And probably arrogantly at the time, I was like, I'm an endurance athlete, like I can do this. It's just a different type of endurance. Um, but yeah, I think just trust the process, enjoy the process. When you hit those lows, just set it aside and walk away and know that like you can come back. Know that it's going to be a long process. It's not going to be solved overnight, and you're going to have like these really great moments and these low lows as well.
mhm,
Um, I would say, just read absolutely as much as you can and take in that information.
mm.
Um, find other people that are doing it and are a couple of years ahead of you and use them as mentors and feedback. I got really lucky. My first time out there, I sat down at breakfast in Birmingham and I ran into two other students that were from Fresno that were also doing their PhDs, and one was 1 year ahead of me, the other was 2 years ahead of me. And so we kind of hit it off and created a community, and I was able to talk with them and they gave me all sorts of advice about, dealing with advisors and like what the process is like. And they could tell me like, oh, this is coming up, this is what the Viva is going to be like. So finding those people that are in the process as well that are at stages ahead of you so you can learn from those. I just like that just happened to me by accident, but looking back now, if you don't have that, definitely seek that out because that was a very helpful thing for me.
Yeah, I think lots of people find that really helpful, and you were less involved in this because your PhD was outside Quaker studies. But one of the things that we do at Woodbrooke in the Centre for Research in Quaker Studies is to have student days that create those opportunities for people to meet other students who are a few years ahead, and just to get some of that wisdom passed down. And I guess that's one of the things we're trying to do, making a recording like this to pass down some of
Right.
those things and insights about how it was. So yeah, I think that's really useful. I'm kind of curious. I'm going to ask you whether I really want to know what advice they had about handling supervisors.
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think. I think one of them had Dr. Cheatham, which eventually ended up becoming uh, one of my smaller like advisors as far as roles go. I'm trying to think of who Ryan had. I don't think I knew who he was. Um, yeah, I don't know if there was anything in particular that they gave me as far as dealing with advisors. It was more of like the process of what to expect that was coming
Yeah.
and the Viva and how to like best get feedback by getting material into advisors and that sort of thing. Um, I think for everybody, it's a unique process because you just have different personalities, you have different topics.
Yeah.
You're your advisors have different roles and different amounts of expertise in what you're doing. So it's kind of, I mean, like it's a unique process for everybody in that way.
Yeah, so just to explain, people might not be familiar. The system is that you usually have a lead supervisor who might be 60% or even 80% of the supervision team, and then at least one other supervisor who's usually 10 or 20%, maybe 40%. And at different times, you had teams with different percentages. So I think I was probably 40% most of the way through, 40 or
Hmm.
60% most of the way through. But then other people were in and out of the supervision team as their capacity allowed.
Right.
And we tried to draw on different areas of expertise as the topic developed, but also as you worked on different areas of the thesis. And I think it was useful over time, I guess, quite a chunk of where your thesis ended up was actually outside my sphere of expertise, but I was able to provide some continuity,
Right.
whereas other people came in with different areas of expertise. So it sounds like quite a lot of what you were talking to the other students about was how to manage that process of submitting draft material to a supervisor for feedback. So giving me enough time to read it, for example.
Mhm.
Is that right? That those were the kinds of things you were?
Yeah, and like everybody has their own process. Like I think some people end up having like the same advisors the whole way through,
Yeah.
and their mine was like I kind of ebbed and flowed. So I would say be ready to roll with the punches if that's the case, because this is such a long process. It can be 3, 4, 5 years. Your advisors may move on to something else, and so be ready to like. Uh, find someone to fill that role, and don't be afraid also to, if that time comes, to like seek out the person that you want. Look at what they've done and what they've studied, and ask for that person that you think is going to be helpful to whatever aspect of the PhD is that you're working on at the time.
Yeah, and yeah, students are welcome to contact staff members who are outside their supervision teams as well to just get advice on a specific question. And I think it can be useful to remember that and to do that sometimes. Um, and so you were saying about how long it can take. The standard timings are that it's 4 years full time and 6 years part time, or 3 to 4 years and 4 to 6 years. But I think I remember rightly that you were full time for several years to start with and then went to part time. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was a little ambitious. I think I submitted like right at the minimum time of 3 years. So I was full
Yeah.
time and submitted at that point in time. Um, and I did my first Viva and got a revise and resubmit. And so then I ended up switching from full time to part time just to buy myself some more time, not knowing what the process was going to look like and how long it was going to take me to revise. Um, I I didn't necessarily need to go to the part-time switch, and to be honest, like I practically speaking, I didn't switch to part-time. I stayed, you know, working on it just as much, but I did that to kind of buy more time. And I think it ended up being right around 5 years total, with two different Vivas and two different drafts. So I think I ended up finishing right around 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was it was quite an involved process because there was this back and forth and the need to do a second version. But as we were saying earlier in the conversation, it did end up being a stronger thesis for
Hmm.
that work. And in fact, you finished in what might be quite a typical period of time.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think I would tell people too, like I had several moments within the process that I could have just like pulled the plug.
Yeah.
in bail. And I would just encourage people like push through. Like there are going to be very tough moments. In fact, I don't even know if I've told you this, but my first trip out there, um, I think I was just struggling with the whole process. I ended up meeting with Dr. Moss, and she had to kind of talk me off the ledge of like I was thinking about going home and just not even like finishing my first week of study. And
Mm.
she was like, "Okay, let's," I still remember she sat down with me and like we wrote out my outline on a napkin, and it was like she was like, "This is the way forward." And she's like, "You don't have to solve all the problems your first week," type of
Yeah.
thing. I had my first submission for a chapter for a piece of writing. I got a like basically a revise and resubmit, and so I had to redo on that. So there were like it was a struggle for me to get up to speed. And then I
Mm.
had bumps in the road along the way. And so I would tell people like just expect that. It's part of the process.
Mm.
If you don't have that, then good for you, and I'm happy for you. I definitely had that.
Mm.
So, um, but it's the I think the struggle makes you better because you persevere and you endure, and it teaches you to overcome some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's very normal to have all sorts of different kinds of bumps. There are the subject matter bumps where you think, oh, I'll never make sense of this, or it's too complicated, or
Mm.
nobody else has written on this, or you get distracted and you do a whole piece of work that doesn't end up being in the thesis.
Yeah, I did a couple of
Um,
those.
yeah, yeah. Some people go down a lot more rabbit holes than others, but I think it
Yeah.
does happen to everybody that you get some things that you look into and then decide actually the editorial decision is this doesn't fit in the thesis, and you have
Mhm.
to set it aside, which can be quite difficult, especially if you found something really interesting, but then it
Mhm.
doesn't go anywhere. Um, and and also those process bumps and things about academic writing and just the norms of how to do that and how you express yourself and the clarifications and the qualifications you have to put in to say, well, we think probably such and such, and um, uh, all of those can create different kinds of bumps, as well as obviously there's the whole of your rest of your life going on, and there might be
Right.
a pandemic, but also all sorts of other things can happen. And I think you changed jobs and things during the PhD process, didn't you?
Yeah, I balanced multiple part-time jobs along the way. And so yeah, like, life is still very much going on, raising three kiddos and
Mm.
pastoring and working jobs and that kind of stuff. So I would say that too is like, like don't allow it to become all consuming to where, you neglect relationships along the way with friends and family, because you're going to want those relationships when you finish the process. So, yeah,
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to, I do sometimes say to people who are starting out, it's more like a marathon than a sprint. You need
right,
to make
very
sure
much.
that you've got those sources of support and that someone's going to hand you a new water bottle and those kinds of
Mhm.
things. So yeah, I know you gave that analogy about being an endurance athlete earlier on. Do you think there are lessons from the rest of your life that applied to being a PhD student?
Yeah, I mean, for me as an endurance athlete, like I kind of took that mentality and that approach of like, okay, this is a long-term goal that's going to take a lot of time. Like you said, like I'm going to need people that are going to support me along the way. That like some of the suffering is just a part of the process. There's going to be bumps in the road.
Mm.
Um, so just to trust the process in that way.
Mm.
Um, one of the things like when I started thinking about the idea of doing the PhD process, I had a lot more people tell me don't do it than do it.
Yeah.
Um, And so like I had to balance that. I had one guy who was a professor local here in town who just sat me down and just gave me the brass tacks of like, hey, look, this is how long it's going to take. This is what it's going to mean for your life. This is how much it's going to cost. This is the reality of the supply and demand for being able to get into a university to teach all of those different things. These are the odds of you being able to even use this.
Mm,
Just really like harsh, honest truth.
mm,
Um, and so like I had to weigh that and go, okay, is that gonna am I gonna allow that to deter me? And ultimately I also had to come to answer the question like, okay, if I graduate and I never teach, would I still be okay with the fact that I did this?
mm,
And ultimately my answer became yes. And so I would say to people, do it for you and like do it if you can answer that question and say, I mean, everybody's different with what field of study they're going into and whether they want to utilize it to become a professor and teach. For me, that was like one of the main goals of doing it. So, but I had to come to the um the space where I was just like, okay, if nothing else, I'm gonna do this for me to gain a title, to gain knowledge, to do it as a sense of accomplishment. And so I would say, hopefully, like if you can come to that process, because the odds of getting in and teaching somewhere is pretty low.
mm,
Uh, and especially with the shifting of academics, with things going online, with universities kind of focusing more on adjunct roles than like tenure tracks and that kind of stuff.
yeah.
I ended up just, I ended up getting lucky with a uh, a professor from the university here in town was at my church. He and I hit it off and went for some runs together. His friend was in the philosophy department. I ended up interviewing in the philosophy department and got into the university. And that way, I didn't end up teaching philosophy, but once I was in, I switched over and now I've been doing some adjunct work in the theology department.
Mm,
Um, so it really, for me, like it's the whole adage of like sometimes it's more about who you know than what you know type of thing. Because I also when I finished graduating, I applied to all sorts of different universities for adjunct work and that kind of stuff, and most of them didn't even respond back. So the supply and demand is pretty tough.
mm.
Uh,
Yeah,
but
I think the lots of job markets are quite tough at the moment, and the academic
Mhm.
job market has been tough for a while. And
Right.
yeah, but I also think it's interesting you say about using your PhD,
Mhm.
and certainly my experience is that I use my PhD in academic work, in teaching, and supporting PhD students, use it
Right.
very directly, but also there are lots of ways in which lessons from my PhD, both like the content of it. So mine was about Quakers and how Quakers talk about God. And actually, I use that all the time, just in conversations with people and in explaining Quaker perspectives and things like that. But also, maybe some of the methods, some of the research methods, some of the
Absolutely.
practices of thinking very rigorously and things. So do you think there are ways in which you use your PhD in that much broader sense as well?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think maybe the most useful would be, um, once you study a topic so in depth, um, you have more humility when you start to approach other topics and less like confidence of like, oh, I know this is true. So now I think my approach with other topics is kind of like, I think I have an idea, but I don't really know that I know. I should probably research it in depth. Um,
So you've learned
so
how much you don't know.
right, yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's just one of the like I think that's a key to just wisdom in general, right? Like is the more you know you don't know.
Yeah.
And so that gives you a sense of humility to go like, I think I know, but like I also know that I've studied something so deep that, and I've only touched the surface level of this topic. I should go and if I really want to know that I know, go and study it kind of in the same way. Um, so that's it. That's been a key aspect for me.
Yeah, and as you say, I think that's a really useful life lesson in general.
Mhm.
And that kind of insight that you've written a whole thesis about biblical anthropology, but actually you could only fit in some issues about physicalism in the Gospel of Mark, and
Right.
there's the rest of the Bible and all of these different questions and things that even in the real in depth of a PhD thesis you weren't able to go into everything.
Right.
And that does, it puts things in perspective, right? That you see how much there is to potentially know that we can't probably fit into one human lifetime.
Yeah, you start to approach a topic with like, well, I have a working model of what I think about that, but like I know that that working model could be tweaked by diving in and searching more and gaining more knowledge. And so you approach stuff with hopefully with more humility,
Mm,
and it gives you grace for people that you disagree with, and you go like, like I've found in studying that I've changed my mind on things, so that gives you grace to approach people and say, like I could be wrong on this topic, and they could be right. Who knows?
mm.
Like
Yeah, and again, that is a really useful thing to be able to do and to then, if someone's willing, to engage deeply and try and understand one another's perspectives. I think that's
Mhm.
a big part of the process that you went through with the thesis to understand the perspectives that different scholars were drawing in, and then you can apply that to lots of other situations in life as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of our hour, and I wonder, just as a kind of finishing thing, firstly, what are you doing now? So we've mentioned some general ways in which you're using those skills from the PhD thesis in the rest of life. But are there specific things you're doing at the moment? I think you're preparing to teach a course for Woodbrooke, is that right?
Yeah, so Dr. Wood at Woodbrook had reached out to me, and I think Woodbrook had somebody kind of in related Anabaptist studies, but not as much anymore. And so he said that they were looking for somebody to do something along the topic of Anabaptism and divine violence.
Mm,
So in the fall, I'll be teaching a 4 week, I think it'll be like an hour and a half lecture
mm,
on divine violence in the Bible. And so there'll be 4 different topics. One is divine violence in the Old Testament. One is divine violence in the atonement theories. One will be in discipleship and nonviolence. And then the other will be violence in the book of Revelation.
mm,
So using those, both the skills that I've learned in the PhD process, and then also partnering that with my Anabaptist background to dive into some of those difficult questions of theodicy and asking the questions of what is God like? Is he violent? And how do we reconcile maybe a Old Testament portrait of God as a warrior with the Jesus portrait of God as a lamb? So.
mm. Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting course, and I'm sure that you and Ben will work together to bring out lots of the interesting nuances in that. Uh, um, yeah, and so finally, do you have any advice if someone is watching this and thinking, should I do a PhD or not? You told us a bit about your friend who sat down and went through all the realities of it, but
Right.
what would you say to somebody who was in that position?
Yeah, I would say know why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Don't do it for somebody else. Do it definitely for you and do it for the right reasons.
Mm,
Um, I would say it is a very rigorous process. It's one of the most rewarding things you'll do in your life. Yeah, I think somebody had said, and I don't remember if it was you or maybe it was Dr. Cheatham that had said, it's the only time where you get to accomplish something and change your name as a result of the process, which is pretty neat. And I still like, having that PhD attached to like my email signature and stuff is something that still kind of like throws me off. Um, but like I think the best things in life are difficult and they're long and they take a process, and the reward comes from that process and the suffering along the way. So I would say don't shy away from it because it's difficult, because some of the best things in life come from uh, difficulty. And so, um, yeah, just know why you're doing it. And, the other thing is like, what's the worst thing that could happen? You could fail trying, but at least you tried, I mean, how many people even try? So I would just say go for it. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, Dr. Tatum.
Yeah.
It's been really good to catch up with you, and I think some of that advice will be really helpful for people who are maybe thinking about this or in the middle of a PhD process, and need some encouragement, as we were saying, to stick with it, to give it a go, know why you're doing it, maybe remind yourself of that in the middle
Hmm.
of the process, and continue. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. Really good to see you.
Yeah.
And to anyone who is watching the live stream or anyone who's catching up with the recording, thank you for watching, and do be in touch with Woodbrooke if you're interested in a PhD in Quaker studies or something related like Anabaptist theology. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Bye
Thanks
for
for having
now.
me.